The morning sky above Los Angeles looked painted in gold. Airliners lifted from the runway one after another, streaks of vapor cutting through sunlight. Among them rose Pacific Air Flight 982, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner bound for Tokyo. Inside sat 280 passengers, families, business travelers, honeymooners, ready for the 12-hour journey across the Pacific. In seat 23A, next to the window, sat Jessica Reed, 25 years old, an aviation engineer from Seattle. She had recently finished a demanding internship with Boeing, specializing in flight control software. This trip was supposed to be the celebration of her new job in Tokyo, a calm transition from student to professional. She loved everything about airplanes: the logic of aerodynamics, the hum of turbines, the elegance of lift and thrust. She'd never wanted to fly planes. She wanted to make them perfect. As the jet climbed, the seatbelt sign blinked off. Cabin crew began service, the smell of coffee mixing with recycled air. Jessica opened her laptop, reviewing a design paper on redundant actuator systems, ironic given what would happen next. 3 hours in, she noticed a distant flash through the window. Weather radar had predicted mild turbulence, but lightning wasn't part of the forecast. The aircraft's gentle vibration turned rougher, like driving over gravel in the sky. A muffled thud echoed beneath the floor. Passengers exchanged worried glances. Then, boom. The Dreamliner jolted so hard that drinks spilled, trays crashed, and a child screamed. Jessica's coffee splashed across her notes. The lights flickered. The engines groaned with an uneven roar. A sharp metallic sound, something like a wrench dropped on steel, rattled through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's strained voice, "we're encountering unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated." But Jessica knew that wasn't just turbulence. The oscillations were too rhythmic, too mechanical. She felt it. The right stabilizer wasn't responding properly. Years of simulator studies had taught her what asymmetric control felt like. She peered out the window. Storm clouds loomed ahead, dark, boiling masses flashing with internal lightning. The plane started to yaw, twisting slightly off course. Oxygen masks dropped. Panic rippled through the cabin like an electric current. Jessica's heart hammered, but her mind sharpened. She pressed her call button. A flight attendant hurried by, wide-eyed. "Ma'am, please stay seated." "I'm an aviation engineer," Jessica said quickly, holding up her ID. "Your flight control system may be failing. Tell your captain that a software reboot loop could cause—" The plane lurched again, cutting her off. Screams echoed. Luggage burst from an overhead bin, striking a seat. Someone cried for God. Jessica grabbed the armrest, knuckles white. Her analytical brain replayed data she'd studied in labs: sensor saturation, actuator lag, feedback overflow. If the hydraulic control loop froze mid-cycle, the pilots could lose authority on one stabilizer. It was rare, but not impossible. Up front, the cockpit was chaos. The captain and first officer, veterans of 20 years, were fighting the yoke. Warning lights cascaded across the display: HYD sys-R fail, stab trim limit, autopilot disk. "Control's not responding," the first officer yelled. "Reboot the actuator system," the captain barked. "It's looping back. She's ignoring commands." The Dreamliner tilted. Outside, the sky turned black. Lightning flared like camera flashes across a sea of thunderheads. Back in the cabin, Jessica unbuckled and stood. Passengers shouted for her to sit, but she steadied herself on seatbacks, moving toward the front. "Miss, you can't go up there," a flight attendant protested. "You don't understand," Jessica said, voice low but firm. "I know this aircraft's control architecture. I can help." The attendant hesitated, then saw Jessica's Boeing ID badge and nodded shakily. "Stay behind me." They reached the reinforced cockpit door. The attendant used the emergency intercom. Inside, frantic voices overlapped. The captain hesitated, then opened the door. Jessica stepped into a storm of alarms and red light. The cockpit windows flashed white with every lightning bolt. Both pilots looked exhausted, fear creeping behind their professionalism. "Who the hell?" The captain started. "Jessica Reed, Flight Control Systems Engineer," she said quickly. "Your right side stabilizer servo's in a feedback loop. Autopilot's feeding corrupted inputs. You have to isolate the actuator bus manually, The first officer blinked. You're telling us the plane's fighting us? Yes. And if you don't isolate it, it'll keep pitching until the hydraulics burn out. The captain exchanged a glance with his co-pilot. Pride and terror wrestled behind his eyes. All right, tell me what to do. Jessica slid into the jump seat, scanning displays. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice didn't. Switch to manual backup. Flight control mode C. Cut the feedback circuit from the right actuator. They obeyed. The aircraft shuddered, alarms momentarily silencing. The pitch stabilized, barely. Okay, Jessica murmured, thinking aloud. Hydraulic pressures fluctuating. We've got partial control, but the storm ahead is growing. You need to divert. The radar glowed crimson, an enormous thunderfront stretching hundreds of miles. We can't go around it, the captain muttered. Fuel's marginal. Then we go through, Jessica said, eyes hard. But we do it smart. Outside, the first drops of rain turned to torrents. Lightning exploded across the horizon, reflecting in Jessica's eyes. She tightened her seatbelt and whispered under her breath, "Please hold together." For the first time, the pilots felt something unexpected. Not fear, but focus. The girl who had appeared from the cabin wasn't panicking. She was thinking. Flight 982 plunged into the storm, its wings slicing through boiling clouds. Passengers prayed in silence while 3 people in the cockpit fought physics itself. And as thunder swallowed the sky, Jessica Reed took a deep breath and prepared to do what no one expected: help fly a 250-ton jet through chaos at 25,000 feet. The cockpit of Flight 982 felt like the center of a hurricane. Every panel flashed red and amber. Warning tones wailed, competing with the thunder cracking outside. Lightning illuminated the clouds so bright that each flash felt like daylight for a second, only to plunge the cabin back into darkness. Jessica Reed sat in the jump seat. Headset clamped over her ears, her heart pounding as if trying to match the rhythm of the alarms. The captain, Mark Collins, was a veteran pilot of over 2 decades. The co-pilot, Ethan Rivera, was younger, quick-handed but shaking. Both men looked terrified, and it terrified Jessica to see it, because pilots were trained to be the calmest people in the sky. Autopilot's dead again, Rivera shouted. Collins cursed under his breath, pulling back on the yoke. Manual input sluggish. We're fighting her. Jessica's eyes darted over the displays. The flight control system wasn't responding uniformly. Left stabilizer good, right one lagging behind by a fraction of a second. That fraction was enough to cause oscillation, the kind that could rip wings off if it grew worse. She leaned forward, voice steady despite the fear. Captain, the actuator feedback is corrupted. You need to hard isolate the right servo input before it overrides again. Collins shot her a doubtful glance. You sure? I designed these systems during my internship at Boeing, she said, fast but clear. You've got 30 seconds before it loops back. Collins didn't argue. He flipped the switch. The plane lurched, then steadied slightly. A few of the warning lights faded. For a brief second, the cockpit went quiet, except for the roar of rain hammering against the windshield. Jessica exhaled slowly. Okay, that's temporary. You've got control for now. The captain turned his eyes toward her. Miss Reed, you just saved us a few thousand feet of freefall. But we're still in the middle of a Category 5 cell. She glanced at the radar. The display looked like a fiery red wound stretching across the Pacific. There was no way around it. The aircraft had drifted into one of the most violent storm formations on record. Air traffic control's not responding, Rivera said, tapping his radio. We're getting too much static. Jessica nodded. Lightning's messing with your comms. Try backup frequency 121.5. International distress. He switched it. The static hiss softened, but no voice came through. Just white noise and the deep growl of thunder. Jessica's mind ran through possibilities. Electrical interference, shorted comm relay, maybe both. She needed to think like an engineer, and like a pilot. All right, Collins said, forcing calm into his tone. We maintain altitude and heading until we clear the worst of it. Then we descend to Honolulu. Captain, Jessica said, if the hydraulic pressure drops again, you won't maintain altitude. The storm's updrafts are forcing asymmetry between the flaps. We need to adjust manually before it overpowers the system. The older man looked at her, a brief flicker of pride and disbelief. You talk like you've done this before, Jessica smiled faintly. Only in simulators. Never at 25,000 feet. A flash of lightning exploded across the windshield, white and blinding. The thunder hit an instant later, a sound so deep it rattled the cockpit. The plane rocked violently. Loose items clattered to the floor. Rivera gripped the throttle. She's rolling right. Counter! Collins barked. Jessica braced against the seat, eyes fixed on the artificial horizon. Stabilizers lagging again. Feed it manual trim. Trim it max. Then disengage the circuit and use mechanical backup. The cockpit filled with grunts and the mechanical clicks of switches. The Dreamliner shuddered again, then slowly straightened out. In the cabin, people screamed as overhead bins popped open. A flight attendant hit the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay seated. Her voice was drowned out by another violent jolt. Jessica pressed the comm button on her headset. Flight 982 to any ATC in range. Do you copy? Static. Then a faint crackle. This is Honolulu. Reading you. Her heart jumped. Honolulu, this is Pacific Air 982. We have multiple system failures, partial hydraulics, both pilots conscious. Request emergency vector to nearest open runway. The signal broke again. Roger. 82. Divert to Honolulu International. Course heading. 152 degrees. The line went dead, but it was enough. Jessica looked at the map. Heading 152. That gives us about 500 miles to go. 500 miles through this storm? Rivera said, voice cracking. You're kidding. Not kidding, Jessica said grimly. And we have to start descent in less than an hour. Hydraulics won't last longer than that, Collins nodded. Then we move. Set heading 152. The plane turned slowly, each degree earned through sheer willpower. The storm raged harder. Rain now poured in torrents, so heavy it blurred the cockpit windows into grey waterfalls. Jessica's pulse raced, but her focus never broke. Every time the aircraft jolted, she adjusted calculations in her head. Pitch angle, drag coefficient, fuel flow. It wasn't just engineering anymore. It was survival math. After 20 minutes of steady heading, the plane stabilized enough for the captain to breathe again. He looked at Jessica and managed a thin smile. You just took my co-pilot's seat. She shook her head. I'm just keeping your plane alive. Rivera chuckled nervously, the sound barely audible over the storm. Captain, we should keep her. Collins laughed once, short, rough, but real. It was the first hint of humanity amid the chaos. But the relief didn't last long. A sudden bang reverberated through the fuselage, louder than thunder, more metallic. Warning lights flared back on. Chwide press low. ENG-2 thrust limit exceeded. Jessica's stomach dropped. We just took a lightning hit, she said. Engine 2's at partial power. Rivera's voice trembled. You mean we're losing an engine? Not yet, she said, eyes narrowing. But if the temperature climbs another 20 degrees, yes. Collins's jaw tightened. All right, Reed, what's our play? Jessica stared at the flickering displays. The aircraft was wounded, bleeding energy, but still airborne. Keep her level. Use engine 1 to maintain thrust balance. We'll glide her if we have to. Collins exhaled slowly. You really think we can land this thing? Jessica looked up, eyes calm but fierce. Captain, I didn't come here to die. And neither did anyone else on this plane. Outside, lightning split the sky again, illuminating her face, drenched in sweat, yet resolute. The young woman from seat 23A, once just a passenger, was now the mind keeping a 250-ton aircraft alive. And far below, in the endless dark of the Pacific, the world waited to see if they would make it out of the storm. The Boeing 787 trembled like a living creature in pain. Every bolt, every panel seemed to groan as Flight 982 battled through the thunderous chaos. Lightning flashed across the wings, revealing the jagged outlines of black storm clouds that stretched for miles in every direction. Jessica's hands were steady, but her breathing had deepened. A slow, controlled rhythm she'd learned during her brief military drone training. The difference was this time she wasn't behind a screen. This time she could feel gravity trying to rip her from the seat. Engine 2 temp spiking. Rivera called out, staring at the thermal gauge. It's past red line. Jessica leaned forward. Feather the fuel valve. Reduce flow by 10%. It'll cool it down enough to buy us time. Won't that drop thrust? It's either that or we lose the engine completely, she replied. The co-pilot nodded and obeyed. The whine of the right engine softened, the vibrations easing just slightly. Captain Collins wiped sweat from his forehead. What's our ETA to Honolulu? Jessica scanned the radar. About 40 minutes, if we hold altitude. Collins gave a dry laugh. If we hold altitude. Big if, huh? Jessica smiled faintly but didn't respond. Her focus returned to the flight display. Wind shear alerts flashing, pressure differentials warning of turbulence ahead. They were approaching the eye wall, the deadliest part of the storm. The cabin intercom crackled. Cockpit, this is Sarah from the crew. Passengers are panicking. We've got people praying, crying. Some can't breathe. Jessica pressed the button. Sarah, listen to me. Tell everyone to stay strapped in and calm. We're still flying. We're not giving up. You'll have to trust us. There was a pause. Then the faintest whisper. Copy that. Godspeed. Collins looked at Jessica. You've got a way of talking to people. She shrugged. Maybe I'm just trying to convince myself too. A deep rumble shook the plane. The altimeter flickered. 20,800 feet. 20,600. 20,300. We're losing altitude, Rivera shouted. Updraft's collapsing, Jessica said quickly. Pitch up 5 degrees. Throttle max on engine 1. The aircraft climbed for a moment, then dropped again, hard enough to make her stomach flip. Alarm screamed. Luggage tumbled in the cabin. Somewhere behind them, a child cried out. Collins gritted his teeth. We can't climb. We're in a downdraft pocket. Jessica's brain fired an overdrive. Downdraft speed. About 2,000 feet per minute. We can't fight that directly. She grabbed the manual control yoke. Don't fight it head on. Angle with it. Use the side flow. Let it throw us forward, not down. The captain hesitated only a second before following her lead. Together they tilted the aircraft slightly starboard. The 787 bucked and groaned, its left wing dipping dangerously. Then suddenly the drop eased. The nose lifted. Altitude stabilized at 23,900. Holy! It worked, Rivera gasped. Jessica exhaled. Never fight a storm's force. You borrow it. For the next 15 minutes, the cockpit became a battlefield of quick decisions and trust. Jessica called out commands like she'd done it her whole life. Flaps at 2 degrees. Trim 0.7 up. Rebalance tanks left sides lighter. Bypass relay on engine 2, we're still losing hydraulic sync. And every time, Collins obeyed. No hesitation, no ego. She had earned his respect. Finally, after an eternity of flashing lights and gut-wrenching drops, a strange calm settled over the cockpit. The rain softened. The thunder retreated to a distant rumble. Collins glanced out the windshield. Are we through it? Jessica peered ahead. For the first time in 2 hours, the sky broke open. Shafts of golden sunlight pierced the dark clouds. They had reached the eye of the storm, a circular pocket of eerie stillness surrounded by towering walls of clouds. It was beautiful, almost holy, a cathedral of light above an ocean that shimmered like liquid glass. Rivera let out a shaky laugh. I can't believe we're alive. Jessica smiled but didn't relax. Enjoy the view, but don't let your guard down. The eye's temporary. We'll hit turbulence again in 15 minutes. Collins looked at her. You sound like a captain. She met his eyes. Right now, I think we all are. They had 35 minutes to reach Honolulu. The weather radar showed a narrow window, a slim corridor between storm cells that could lead them out to safety. But the margin for error was razor thin. Jessica plotted a course. Heading 1 to 38 should thread us between the cells. But we'll have to start descent soon or we'll overshoot. Collins frowned. Descent? With one engine half dead and hydraulics barely alive. Jessica's gaze was steady. It's either descend now or we run out of fuel trying to go around. He nodded grimly. Then we descend. Jessica took the controls again, her hands trembling only slightly now. Setting descent rate, 800 feet per minute. The nose dipped gently. The calm air of the storm's eye was deceptive, like flying through glass. Then, as predicted, the plane hit the far wall. The piece shattered. The 787 jolted violently as winds slammed into it from all sides. Rain pounded the windshield again, louder than before. Rivera shouted, "We're back in it!" Jessica's voice cut through the chaos. "Stay with it. This is the last wall before clear skies." The turbulence hit like cannon fire. The nose pitched down sharply. Alarms screamed, "Stall!" "Stall!" Collins yelled. "Recovering!" "Not too hard," Jessica warned. "Don't overcorrect." The aircraft bucked, climbed, then fell again. The engines howled in protest. For a split second, Jessica saw the altimeter dip below 15,000 feet. Her stomach tightened. If they fell below 10,000 before clearing the storm, they'd never make landfall. She turned to Collins. "Trust me?" He looked at her, eyes fierce but calm. "With my life." Jessica took full control. "Then hold on." She pulled the yoke with both hands, just enough to stabilize, then adjusted thrust manually, not by the readings, but by instinct. The vibration pattern under her palms told her what the instruments couldn't. And then, miraculously, the clouds broke. The blinding blue of the Pacific sky flooded the cockpit. Below them stretched the endless ocean, and far, far ahead, a faint strip of green and gray shimmered in the sunlight. Rivera gasped. "Land, that's Oahu!" Jessica smiled, her eyes wet with relief. "We're almost home." The passengers erupted into applause in the cabin. Some cried openly, some prayed. But Jessica knew it wasn't over yet. One final test remained, the landing. With one failing engine, damaged hydraulics and unpredictable winds, bringing the Dreamliner down would be harder than keeping it in the air. She looked at the captain. "We can see land, but getting down in one piece, that's the real challenge." Collins nodded slowly. "Then let's make history." The storm faded behind them like a ghost. Ahead, Honolulu awaited, and the moment the world would never forget. The Pacific shimmered below like an endless mirror, sunlight dancing on the restless waves. Far ahead, the faint outline of Oahu glowed under a break in the clouds. The passengers of Flight 982 began to cheer, but inside the cockpit, the tension was suffocating. Jessica stared at the flight display. One engine was barely responding, the hydraulic systems were bleeding pressure, and the storm still clawed at their tail. They had escaped the tempest, but they weren't out of danger. Not yet. Captain Collins exhaled shakily. "We'll contact Honolulu Tower for emergency priority." "Already on it," said Rivera, switching frequencies. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Pacific Air 982. We've sustained major hydraulic damage, partial engine failure. Request immediate landing clearance." A voice crackled back through the radio. "Pacific 982, Honolulu Tower. Runway 8L cleared for emergency approach. Winds at 28 knots, gusting to 35. Fire and rescue are standing by." Jessica bit her lip. "Crosswinds. Perfect." She took a breath and said, "We're going to have to come in heavy. We can't dump fuel at this speed, or the imbalance will worsen." "We'll have one shot," Collins nodded grimly. "You've come this far, Jessica. You call the approach." The cockpit went silent except for the hum of the failing engine. Jessica looked out the windshield. The Hawaiian coastline was growing larger. The runway, a dark ribbon against emerald fields. Her mind ran simulations faster than any computer. Airspeed, thrust margin, crosswind angle, drag coefficient with partial flaps. Everything she'd studied, every diagram she'd ever memorized. It all converged in this one impossible moment. "Okay," she said quietly. "Descent to 4,000 feet, flaps 5 degrees. Maintain 180 knots. We'll line up on visual." The aircraft descended, cutting through scattered clouds. Below, Honolulu stretched in serene contrast to the chaos they'd survived. Beaches, highways, palm trees swaying gently in the wind. But inside the cabin, fear still hung thick. Many passengers clasped hands, others sobbed quietly. A mother whispered prayers over her sleeping child. In seat 23A, where it had all begun, Jessica's now empty coffee cup rolled with each small jolt of turbulence. "Final approach in 3 minutes. Rivera announced. Winds are pushing 35 knots from the right. Jessica adjusted the trim manually, compensating with 3 degrees rudder offset. The plane rattled violently, wind buffeting the fuselage. Collins glanced at Jessica. That crosswind's going to make touchdown hell. She didn't flinch. We'll crab in. Straighten just before flare, he smiled faintly. You've done this before? Only in simulators, she said. Never with 200 people behind me. As they neared the coast, air traffic control came alive with voices. Cargo flights diverted, runways cleared, emergency teams ready. News channels already caught wind of the incident. Boeing 787 in distress over the Pacific. Cameras turned skyward. At 1 to 200 feet, warning alarms blared again. Hydraulic pressure critical, Rivera shouted. Jessica's eyes darted to the screen, 0.8 psi and falling. She made a snap decision. Switch to manual backup. Forget automation. We fly her raw. Collins disengaged the last of the autopilot systems. The controls stiffened under his hands. The aircraft felt heavy, sluggish, like dragging a mountain through the air. Jessica wrapped her hands around the yoke. Okay, we'll do this together. On my mark, gentle nose down. Not too steep. Copy that, said Collins. The Dreamliner began its final descent over the shoreline. The ocean sparkled below, deceptively peaceful. The control tower's voice echoed in their headsets. Pacific 982, you are clear to land. Winds 28 knots gusting to 37. Godspeed. Jessica gripped the controls tighter. Flaps 15. Gear down. The gear doors opened with a groan and the landing gear locked in place. The entire airframe shuddered. Wind screamed around the cockpit windows. Speed 165 knots, Rivera said. Perfect, Jessica replied. Her voice was calm, eerily calm. At 800 feet, the gusts hit hard. The Dreamliner rolled sharply to the left. Jessica counted instantly, fighting the yoke like it was alive. Hold it, she muttered. The ground rushed up. Trees, rooftops, runway lights. The plane was coming in sideways, nose angled into the wind. Passengers gasped as they saw the tilted horizon through their windows. Collins shouted, "We're crabbing too hard!" "Wait for it," Jessica whispered. Not yet, not yet. At 50 feet. She kicked the rudder straight, leveled the wings, and pulled back gently on the yoke. Thud. The main gear slammed onto the runway. Sparks flying as the suspension absorbed the brutal impact. A heartbeat later, the nose gear hit. The tires screamed against the tarmac, smoke curling behind them. "Reverse thrust!" Collins yelled. "Engine 2's dead," Rivera cried. "Then one'll have to do," Jessica shouted. The Dreamliner roared down the runway, one engine straining, hydraulics barely responding. Jessica pushed the manual brake override, fighting the wind's pull. Speed 80 knots, 70, 60. The end of the runway loomed. Jessica pulled back on the yoke slightly to ease drag, then slammed the manual brakes to max. The aircraft screeched to a halt just 20 meters before the safety barrier. Silence. For the first time in hours. Pure, unbroken silence. Then applause erupted. It started with a few passengers, then spread like wildfire. Cheers, sobs, laughter. People hugged strangers, screamed Jessica's name without even knowing it. The cabin lights flickered back on, and sunlight poured through the windows. Jessica exhaled and closed her eyes. Her hands trembling finally released the controls. Collins looked at her in awe. "You just did the impossible," he said softly. "You saved every soul on this plane." Jessica gave a tired smile. "We all did. It was never just me." Outside, emergency trucks surrounded the aircraft. Fire crews sprayed foam along the hot tires. Medics rushed to assist passengers, though none were seriously hurt. When Jessica stepped out of the cockpit, the entire cabin burst into standing applause. A little girl ran up and hugged her leg, whispering, "Thank you for saving us." Jessica knelt, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "You were so brave," she said. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, news networks around the world flashed the headline, 25-year-old American engineer lands Boeing 787. After pilot collapse, saves 280 lives. Airlines called her a hero. Engineers called her a miracle. But when reporters asked Jessica what gave her the courage, she only said, "When everything fell apart. I just did what I was trained to do, keep flying, no matter what." and somewhere above the clouds, where the last storm faded into twilight, the sky seemed to whisper back, a tribute to the girl who refused to let fear win.